Now, I'm absolutely delighted to see so many Bruin engineers join us today from all over the world, with alumni calling in from Brazil, from Italy, from India, from Singapore, just to name a few countries. Um, in these fraught times, so much is happening around us with the shocking death of George Floyd in Minnesota and so much else. It is good to have us all gather here together as a family to reaffirm our values and our commitment to each other. So these gatherings are deeply important. Uh, we look forward to celebrating the reunion classes with years ending in 5 and 0 next May in person at a joint reunion. But meanwhile, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge this milestone anniversary of your graduations from UCLA Samueli. Now, whether it's been 5 or 25 or 50 years, I hope that the knowledge and skills and values that you've gained from your time here have served you well in your professional careers. And I know that many of you have remained active in helping our school. So let me share a few highlights about our current students, which I hope will give you even more reasons to be proud of your school. Our student chapter of the ACM, the Association for Computing Machinery, was again recognized for excellence in school service by its international parent organization. And a team composed of our civil engineering students won top honors in a National Environmental Protection Agency contest for their innovative stormwater capture and sustainability designs at a local elementary school. Now, these are just a couple of examples to let you know that our current students are committed to putting their knowledge to good practice in order to benefit the greater good. I'd like to give a special shout out to all of those who have served in this year's reunion committee. And I also want to acknowledge the generosity of the 5 and 0 classes who raised more than 220,000 in annual gift funds through this year's reunion campaign. This support is going to be absolutely invaluable to us in helping our school meet the challenges of COVID-19. Now, similar to our alumni who quickly rose to action, many of our faculty members have transitioned their work in order to address this public health crisis. For example, bioengineering professors Ben Wu and Jake Schmidt and their lab members were quick to make vitally important PPE, personal protective equipment, for frontline healthcare workers. Faculty members in our computational medicine and CS departments, Professors Eran Halperin and Eliezer Eskin and their team, put together an online survey that helps capture real-time spread of COVID-19. And a machine learning model developed by computer science professor Chanchan Gu and his students has been helping the CDC predict the spread of the coronavirus. So I've been so impressed with the resiliency and the compassion of our students as well, as remote instruction and stay-at-home orders took effect in March. Our seniors quickly modified their senior class campaign to raise money to support their fellow engineering students through initiatives like tech grants. These grants enable students, regardless of background, to have reliable access to the internet. And now, who better to speak to the promise and the perils of the internet than today's distinguished speaker, Vint Cerf. Now, for many of you, Vint is a familiar name. He's a distinguished alumnus of UCLA, having received his master's and his PhD in computer science in the 1970s. And for many years, he's been vice president and the chief internet evangelist for Google. He is best known as the co-designer of the TCP/IP protocols and the architecture of the internet. Think of it as the underlying blueprint that helps all of your friends around the world see and share the same dance videos on TikTok or the same video game streams on Twitch or whatever else you use the internet for. Now, in a meta way, it's how we're all able to connect today with each other right now. For this globally influential work, Vint has received some of the world's most prestigious scientific honors, including the Turing Award, the Charles Stark Draper Award, the Japan Prize, and the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering. He is a recipient of the US National Medal of Technology and the US Presidential Medal of Freedom. And beyond his accomplishments and many honors, Vint is one of the world's foremost thinkers and writers on the role of technology in society.
Good evening. Dean Murthy seems to have temporarily, her videos to have frozen, but on that note, I will say we are very excited to have Vint Cerf joining us this evening, and we'll gladly invite him to kick off his speech. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry that Dean Murthy froze up there. That's sort of a scary thing to think that the internet is not serving all of the needs that it should be serving. We'll come to that in a moment. First of all, let me start out by saying congratulations to anyone who is graduating now, and certainly to all of you who are celebrating reunions. In my case, I departed UCLA to go up to Stanford University in 1972. So I'm 48 years ago, left the UCLA campus and counting. Speaking of counting, one of the most spectacular events took place today in Florida, and that is the launch of the SpaceX vehicle carrying 2 crew members to the International Space Station and returning the first stage back to the landing platform, all of which is just spectacular. It really is very close to science fiction. I remember watching Flash Gordon in the 1950s on the black and white television. So the future has arrived, and it's very exciting to see that successful launch. Speaking of which, the Arpanet, the predecessor to the internet, was launched at UCLA starting in September of 1969. By November, we had 2 nodes running, and by the end of December, there were 4. But that launch of the Arpanet triggered the ultimate development of the internet, which began several years later, around 1973. But in Len Kleinrock's lab, the first interconnections of the Arpanet nodes happened over 50 years ago now. So now here we are, it's 2020, and we are faced with a great many challenges, not the least of which is the COVID-19 pandemic, and now social unrest in the United States in the aftermath of a terrible murder in Minneapolis. So we now need to cope with a variety of challenges that lie before us. I've had personal experience with COVID-19. My wife and I were tested positive for this towards the end of March. We're pretty sure we picked it up while we were in London for about 10 days. And we were lucky that the symptoms were fairly mild, but I can tell you that during the course of the disease, you don't know for sure that they will stay mild. And so this was a very stressful period, especially because we had trouble getting tests to confirm that the disease was present. And then after that, even if you knew that you were infected, there were no treatments, there was no vaccine. And most doctors didn't want to talk to you anyway because they didn't want to be infected themselves. And so they were insisting on remote consultations, which bothered me a great deal because my reaction to this isn't medicine. You don't have my blood pressure, you don't have my weight, you don't have my temperature, you don't have any other samples that you should be taking. And so this was actually a disturbing and still very disturbing recognition that this particular disease has interfered dramatically with infrastructure, in which I would include medical and healthcare, supply chains, and all the other things. The fact that this disease does not allow us to work in close proximity to each other has really interfered with our normal society. Haircuts, going to the marketplaces, going to the doctor's office, all the other things that we normally would do in a face-to-face environment has now had to be either terminated or it's just, essentially postponed, or reincarnated in some way in the way that we are now having this reunion in an online way. So the internet has been taxed significantly as a consequence of COVID-19. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the internet role as we, or at least as I now see it, in the light of that pandemic, and then looking forward towards other potential disruptive events, not least of which is global warming, but there may be recurrence of either COVID-19 or other related illnesses that will be equally challenging. So let's talk a little bit about what the internet has brought forward. One thing, obviously, is what we're doing now. And what's interesting about what we're doing now is that we are essentially pressing the capacity of the internet symmetrically, while for the last decade or so, an asymmetric use was it grew very rapidly. Netflix, for example, made a big bet that sending DVDs through the mail could be replaced by sending streaming video through the internet. And so the internet service providers adapted their infrastructure in many cases to be asymmetric, to give a higher capacity download than upload. What is now, of course, happened is that the video conferencing we're doing requires capacity in both directions. And amazingly, and for the most part, it has seemed to work pretty well. There are clearly places where the internet is inadequate or doesn't exist at all, or isn't accessible, or isn't affordable. There's a broad range of issues that have to be addressed in order to remediate those deficiencies. But it's still pretty surprising from my point of view that things have worked as well as they have. Of course, if you know enough about something, it's always astonishing when it works. And I would confess to you, whenever I go on the web and I pull up a web page and it actually arrives, when I think of all the things that have to have happened for that to work, I sit here thinking, wow, that's amazing. So what has happened in the last roughly 35 years of the evolution of the internet is that we've seen media become a portion of the network. There's lots going on. The World Wide Web, of course, is there, but social media have become a major thing in the internet and the World Wide Web environment. And what I would say is that we're learning now that these media, whether it's Facebook or YouTube or Twitter or Instagram or some of the other social media, is that they've been very attractive to consumers, but they have also generated a kind of reward system which biases the system in the direction of what I will call extremism. What I mean by this is simply that these systems have a reward structure which basically says, you get more credibility if you have more views, or if you have more likes, or if you have more followers. And the problem with that feedback loop is that some people realize that extreme expression gets more attention. And the consequence of that is that you see a growing amount of extreme content showing up on the network. So we have to figure out how to adjust the reward schemes in these social media in order to balance the way in which they get used. Of course, every one of you is well aware of the problem of misinformation and disinformation, which has been propagated through the World Wide Web, through the internet, through social media, often for very nefarious purposes. We need to figure out how to counter that. It's very difficult. Algorithms are not easy to detect misinformation and disinformation. The best detector, in my opinion, is the wetware up here, with people thinking critically about what they're seeing and hearing, thinking, where did this information come from? Is there any corroborating evidence of assertions that are being made? Can I do any fact checking? Is there some incentive for someone to put the information up to get me to do something I don't want to do, or that I don't want to believe? Of course, on the flip side of this, people believe things and it makes them feel it's an identity issue. They become part of a group. The group has beliefs that they hold dear. And if somebody says, well, I'm sorry, your belief is wrong, and here's a fact to prove it, some people will reject that and say, I don't want to admit I was wrong. So there's a lot of psychology and brain function associated with the way in which the internet is used and abused. We need to learn a lot more about that. Now, let me switch gears to a more positive view of the internet, and that is its capacity to share scientific information. It is an enormous, huge repository of information, which can be used to advance the state of the art in scientific thinking and developments. The cloud computing systems are providing capacity like we never had before to the general public, in addition to specialized systems like supercomputers. We are exercising machine learning technology, which can ingest and analyze and look for correlations in vast quantities of information. These are very powerful tools, and they are awaiting use by the scientific community to inform our decision making. And that leads me to one other observation about computing in general, and that is this notion of computational X, computational linguistics, computational biology, computational cosmology. We are learning how to model our world using very, very high power computing techniques. And those techniques are actually helping us in the COVID-19 case, for example, rapidly getting the genetic sequence, understanding how the various crowns and spikes of the COVID-19 virus are used to attach to cells and inject DNA, or in this case, RNA, into the cell. All of those mechanical functions are leading us to understand how to interfere with the way in which the virus either reproduces or has its effect on the cells of our body, on the organs of our body. So this is all very exciting stuff. And I would say that it's also leading me to believe that we are in the middle of yet another interesting transformation. You've all heard the term Internet of Things. I'd like to draw your attention to the Internet of Medical Things. And the idea here is that if, in fact, the doctors insist on remote consultation, then we should have devices at home which will provide at least basic information, temperature, blood pressure, pulse what oxygenation in our bloodstreams, and other easily captured medical parameters, so that a remote consult is actually closer in spirit to one which is face-to-face in the same room. And eventually, as time goes on, we may be able to use devices locally at home or in the office in order to gather increasing amounts of information that will help diagnostic processes be more successful. And it will also allow for remote medicine to places where doctors are not readily available. And so in some interesting and almost ironic way, the pandemic may move us in the direction of remote medicine in ways in which we might not otherwise have accelerated to get to the destination. So looking towards the future, we can see several trends. One is increased capacity, increased bandwidths provided by optical fiber, provided by 4G and now 5G radio systems, Wi-Fi 6, which is double to quadruple the capacity of the other Wi-Fi that's available today. It's also leading us to want to measure more about how well the internet service is actually being delivered in places where it's consumed. And one thing I can tell you is that, for sure, is that increasing the capacity of the connection to the house or the office is only part of the story. You may have to replace a lot of the interior Wi-Fi or Ethernet distribution systems because those are becoming older and they don't have the same bandwidth that the delivery access has. And so we're going to need measurement tools in order to verify that, replace, and confirm that we have better capacity on the net. We're also starting to see access provided not only by a rapidly increasing number of undersea cables, but also efforts like Elon Musk's SpaceX to put up the Starlink system, which is somewhere on the order of 24 to 40,000 satellites in low Earth orbit, which in effect will mean it will be almost impossible to avoid connection to the internet on every square inch of the surface of the Earth, which will solve my problem as the chief internet evangelist, which is always to try to get more internet out there. So I'm hoping that Elon and others will be successful in what they're doing. There's controversy over having that many satellites in orbit, so this is not a slam dunk. There's also questions about cost. Driving cost out to make it affordable is very important to getting internet into places where disposable incomes are relatively low. So there's a lot of work to be done here to achieve my target, which is getting everybody up on the net who wants to be up on the net. I recently saw a research report showing that a single optical fiber has been able to deliver something on the order of 40 terabits a second of capacity by using 1024 QAM and multiple light waves on a common fiber. A very impressive result, 50-kilometer distance. And that would actually serve incredibly well, at least inside of a data center, if not, in a terrestrial setting. So there's plenty to see happening. Free space lasers are starting to show up, as well as a last mile or at least intermediate mile mechanism as an alternative to pulling fiber, for example. Finally, I can't not say something about the interplanetary extension of the internet, which has been in evolution since 1998, thanks to a team at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and the other NASA laboratories around the US and the other space agencies like JAXA and ESA and so on. That effort has been underway for a little over 20 years now. We've reached the point where we standardized the protocols. They're on the International Space Station. The prototypes are in use, linking the Earth with Mars and the rovers and orbiters that are in place there. And these new protocols will be used for the Artemis program to return to the moon. And of course, over time, I hope they'll be adopted and used by all the spacefaring agencies as they launch new space vehicles to explore the solar system, both manned and unmanned robotic modes, and then become repurposed to be nodes of an interplanetary backbone. I could go on, and I already have, and I'll stop there. I know Dean Murthy has some questions, and perhaps you do as well. So thank you for allowing me to participate in this reunion. I'm really looking forward to the further discussion.
Thanks a lot, Vint. That was fascinating. I've got a whole bunch of questions for you. So I'm going to ask you a few, and then we'll open this up to our audience, okay?
Okay.
Great, excellent. So let me ask you this, all right? Since COVID is on everybody's mind, what surprised you, particularly from your vantage point as a technologist, as a person who's been thinking a lot about technology in society? What surprised you about this whole COVID-19 thing and the internet and digital infrastructure? What is it that you didn't expect that happened?
Well, I think the most dramatic effect of COVID-19 has been the fact that we have had to physically distance ourselves from each other and to wear masks because of the fact that it propagates through the air. And I hadn't fully appreciated how disruptive that is of much of our infrastructure. So the supply chains were enormously disrupted. We were seeing farmers burning and throwing away or burying their product because they couldn't get it delivered to restaurants who could not serve customers because they couldn't have the customers close together. So I had not appreciated how fragile our supply chain infrastructure is and how fragile a lot of our other economy is when you suddenly say people cannot be face-to-face anymore, or they have to be too far apart. I don't know if it's obvious, but I need a haircut, and I haven't had one for 2 months, and I was too chicken to try to cut it myself. So the disruption of the supply chain, owing to this particular aspect of the pandemic, its propagation through the atmosphere, completely surprised me. I had not thought through all the consequences of that. Of course, now the internet is being used in order to try to redress some of that by allowing people to be face-to-face remotely. And what I also realized is that there is a huge divide between people whose jobs can be done remotely, like mine, and many of the jobs at Google. I mean, we have 100,000 people, most of whom are working at home right now, except for those who must be physically present because a piece of equipment breaks and you have to replace it, or you have to turn the power back on or do something else, or you have to stock the grocery shelves, or you have to be in an operating room operating on a patient, or all of the other things that are so vital to our social and economic well-being that are disrupted by this distancing requirement. So I frankly just had not thought my way through that. The result is that now I realize we need to think much more carefully ahead of time in order to be better prepared. And we know that there was preparation, at least thought about preparation about a pandemic and the need for protective equipment and the need for testing and all this other stuff. But we sort of didn't execute very well. And so we can go back and there'll be lots of finger pointing. But forgetting the finger pointing, let's think now about what we need to do to prepare for a future pandemic or other major disruption. Speaking of which, the other big long-term major disruption we all know about is global warming. It will have massive effects. We can use technology to help us figure out where those effects will be most strongly felt. And we should be thinking about tactics and policies that will counter the effects of global warming, including not rebuilding homes, residences, and offices in places that are going to be subject to flooding, for example. So again, I could go on and on, but you can see the thrust here is use our computing capability in order to help plan for a response to various and sundry kinds of major disruptions.
Oh, I agree. I mean, I'll tell you what shocked me about this whole thing, what surprised me, that we were unable to detect it or act on it on such a huge event. I mean, something that sort of brings half your economy to its knees and you shut it down in a couple of weeks. And we didn't know it was coming. Or maybe there were parts of our government high up that knew them, or some people knew it, some people didn't. But I can tell you that as a dean in an engineering school, I didn't know this was coming. And that really shocked me, that there would be an event of this magnitude that we could not detect, all right? And that was stunning.
Actually, there's another aspect of this which shows you what a perfect storm COVID-19 is. Yeah. And that's the fact that people can be shedding virus without knowing that they're sick. And so it's very likely that my wife and I were shedding virus from the 12th of March to the 17th, at which point I started showing signs of the disease. So I'm, shaking hands with people and, or bumping elbows anyway, and breathing the same air for at least a week. And looking back and realizing that you don't know that you're infected, so you don't know you should be taking steps, to cover your breathing, putting on a mask. Nobody knew that, and so the problem here is that we actually have to be more creative in our thinking about how bad this could get. What are the worst cases that of various kinds of disruption, not just pandemics, might we imagine, and then how would we counter them? We're going to have to get a lot more creative. Maybe we should hire a bunch of science fiction writers to help us imagine the worst case scenarios so we can at least have thought about how we would respond.
Yeah, I was intrigued by your idea of the Internet of Medical Things. And, we've been, at the Samueli School, been talking a lot about smart cities and smart infrastructure and, putting in a whole bunch of sensors and tracking data. This is a big driving theme in the school and really at UCLA. It seems like if we have that kind of infrastructure, people monitoring symptoms or, sewage or wastewater or whatever, we may have been able to detect something like this. Sounds like we're at the very early stages of using an Internet of Things or an Internet of Medical Things or smart infrastructure. What do you think?
Well, there is a flip side to this, and that's privacy. And there is a huge issue associated with how much information is collected, how closely bound is it to people. You can remember just recently that Google and Apple have gotten together to try to build a tracking application for mobiles, trying to tell people that if you will participate in this, then we will assign, random numbers to you, so that, and we'll change those random numbers over time so that they're not bound to any particular person for very long at all, and not bound to any personal information. But if you allow the recording of devices of those random numbers in proximity to each other based on Bluetooth, then if any one of the parties who's participating in this thing announces, I have been diagnosed positive for COVID-19, the system can then broadcast to everyone who is participating that we can tell if they were in proximity to that particular ID at that particular time. We don't have to know where that was. We only have to know that they were adjacent to each other to send out a warning. Now, there could be lots of false positives as a result, but there's no privacy lost in this process because of all the randomization. It seems to me that now we have to get past people's conspiracy theories who believe that, that privacy is impossible to protect. But we really need to adjust ourselves to these kinds of tactics. And I think similarly about health information. If we can anonymize it and aggregate it, we will have much better information about you, through which we will make better policy decisions. We will have a better understanding of the nation's health or the state's health or the health of a city or portion of a city. We need that kind of information. Otherwise, we will be making policy in the dark. Not a good idea.
So that kind of brings me to the question of this interplay between private industry, the Googles and the Facebooks and so on, and government. So there's many different questions around that. You brought up the question of privacy. You had talked about this, this reward system that's rewarding extremist behaviors, and so people congregating in their own little communities and walling themselves off from each other. So much complexity around the internet. What is the role of private industry versus government? How should they interact? Is what we have now working? How can it work better?
Well, it's not working as well as it needs to, because it's very clear that the social media have been abused not only by domestic citizens here in the U.S., but also by foreign powers, by a documented abuse of the system by injecting divisive information into the various social media, by literally funding rallies to cause parties to be more against each other than they might otherwise be. That's a really serious problem. And because the platforms that are in use are supplied by private industry, there's a challenge for the private sector to figure out what to do. We are living in a country that believes in freedom of expression. We believe in the freedom of the press. We believe the government should not suppress the press. Some people misunderstand that as meaning you can just say anything you want to and that's okay. And the answer is no, that's not okay. Hopefully, we will find better policies that we can adopt. But people who say, well, the platforms should use algorithms in order to get rid of misinformation and disinformation. That's really hard to do. To get an algorithm to correctly detect that something is false is very difficult. And I have to remind the scientists who are in this reunion that as scientists, we run into a particularly tough problem. We may have theories that we hold dear for the last 40 years. And then somebody does an experiment that blows up the theory because the theory predicted X and the experiment showed Y. And if you're a good scientist, you give up that cherished theory and say, I need to revise the theory to match the data. That's very hard to do. I mean, you basically have to say, I was wrong. People don't like to do that. So it leads to the following scenario. Let's imagine for a moment, Dean Murthy, that I come to you for expert advice on some topic. And 10 years ago, when I went to you to say, what do I do? You said, you should do X. And I thank you very much for that. And I go off and I follow your advice. 10 years later, I'm still having a problem. And I come back again and say, Dean Murthy, I'm still having a problem. What should I do? 10 years ago, you told me to do X. And you say, well, I've been working on this for the last 10 years. And I now believe you should do Y, which is different from X. Now, there are only two reactions to this. One of them is, thank you very much. I appreciate the value of the new research. The other reaction is, so you lied to me back 10 years ago because X isn't true anymore. And why should I believe Y? Because you're obviously a liar. I mean, this is a serious problem for scientists. How do we convey to the general public the way in which the scientific method works and why there is controversy and why we're willing to tolerate the possibility that a theory has to be abandoned? How to get that into people's heads and be comfortable with that is still a conundrum.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So, so let's turn to education, right? Because after all, we've got all of these students at UCLA, and of all the populations at UCLA that have had to do this 180-degree flip, it's really got to be our students. I mean, literally overnight, flipping to remote learning. Of course, our faculty had to do it as well. And it's been a mixed bag. I mean, first off, I got to say, how happy I am that we were able to do it at all. I mean, and the internet allowed us to survive. That's the first thing I got to say. I mean, you can complain about Zoom or remote this and that, but the truth is that we're able to deliver instruction and keep going through this pandemic, a global historic pandemic, and we're still able to make degree progress and still teach our students. So there is that. But there's a lot that ain't there yet. Can you see a time when remote learning would actually be as good or better than face-to-face instruction?
Well, I think I would not juxtapose them quite that way. I believe there is a role for online education. There is a role for in-place education. But I will say that we've learned a lot since the first big MOOCs happened. You may remember one from Stanford on artificial intelligence, and the guys who taught that course, Sebastian Thrun, who was a former Google employee, and Peter Norvig, thought they might have a couple of hundred people signing up, and 160,000 people signed up. And of course, their first reaction was, what was that? Then they had to figure out how to deal with scale. And so there was a lot of hype about massive online open courses. We learned that it was harder to do than it looks. For example, if you're really trying to teach a course that someone could take on their own, then you need to test frequently to find out how well they're absorbing the information. And then, here's the hard part, you have to imagine all the ways in which people could misunderstand your obviously crystal clear lectures. And then you have to create remedial material that takes into account that misunderstanding. And you have to do all of that. It's really hard to think your way through all the various mistakes. Although I learned from my own experience teaching at Stanford how easily students could misunderstand my extremely clear questions on final exams. I mean, there's no way you could misunderstand this. And I learned very quickly, yes, there was, and there were quite a few different ways, in fact. So that's one issue. This is hard work to make those online courses do well, especially if you're trying to do one that's personal instead of just a mass lecture of some kind, but some personal thing. Georgia Tech has done very well with their master's degree program in electrical engineering. The part that I find most intriguing, and this is very relevant to your responsibilities at UCLA, is that you may be able to serve a much larger audience than you could serve in a physical setting at the university. So you might have literally 10,000 students taking a particular class as opposed to 100 of them. And that might mean that if the costs are more or less the same for teaching that class, even if they were double, you might be able to drop the cost dramatically, which is what Georgia Tech has done, and perhaps UCLA has done or will do, because of the size of the classes and the distribution of the cost. So that's very attractive. The second thing that's attractive is that we now realize that people, we hope, are going to live longer lives. If they live to 100 years, their careers could last 60 to 70 years, maybe even 80 years. We know that technology is going to change. UCLA is one of the change makers. And over a period of 8 decades, there are going to be dramatic changes in technology. And so whatever work you were doing the last decade may not be suitable and useful in the next decade or the decades that follow. You have to go back to school. And so instead of having this 4-year degree program or the much longer programs for advanced degrees, in addition to that, we are going to need continuous learning programs available to people who need to learn new things in order to be productive in their jobs and careers. And so I am persuaded that the universities will be reinventing themselves, partly because of the technology and partly because of the need that long lives will impose on education.
Yeah. Oh, and I think, the role of face-to-face in person versus remotely delivered and what fractions and percentages, you might do this. It depends on your point in life. The thing that really surprised me, another thing that surprised me is how much our students value being on campus, all right? And teaching and learning are a part of that, but their social connection to each other, and it's not just, drinking beer and going to parties, though those are, an important part of growing up, but that there's a huge amount of learning that happens when students interact with each other. Social learning about about engineering or whatever else. That accidental interaction, that interaction that you never planned on, and and lifelong friendships that breed security and, therefore a frank transfer of information and ideas. I mean, these are deeply important particularly when you're 18, all right? When you're 18 or 20, this matters a lot. And then as you get older and you get yourself a job, you're earning good money, you don't want to take a couple of years off to go get a degree. We've got students in our master's online program who are actually fairly local in and around the LA area, but who will take their courses remotely, and in fact appreciate it very much because it allows them to keep going with their jobs. They don't have to get on 405 and battle traffic, all kinds of reasons, right? So you're right. I mean, there's going to be a real mixture of these things, and universities are going to have to be very nimble in providing all of these transitions that happen through a human being's life. I mean, I'm amazed at where we are. But what's your sense of the current state of technology? I mean, I'm struck by how linear and constrained many of our platforms really are, right? I mean, Zoom or others, I mean, we can't talk to each other in the way that we do physically.
So I briefly mentioned a few things that are happening. I didn't mention hollow core fiber, which is under development at the University of Southampton. Sir David Payne, was the inventor of erbium doped fiber, which allowed us to propagate signals without repeaters over much longer distances. Now he's looking at how to double the speed of light in a fiber. Well, not quite double, but maybe 50% faster, because you could propagate the light through a hollow core. And it means going through atmosphere rather than going through glass, and the refractive index is different. And so that's kind of exciting. If you can make enough of the hollow core glass, then you could actually increase the effective speed of light in the fiber and therefore reduce delay. So that's one interesting development. I already mentioned the multi-terabit fiber that's recently come out of laboratory testing. There's another interesting possibility when it comes to higher frequency transmissions in the radio space. Ted Rappaport at New York University is very much involved in the 60, 70, 80, 100 gigahertz bandwidths, which they require to be closer together in order to achieve those bandwidths. But recently I saw a report of a laser, free space laser running at 1550 angstroms, and it was capable of delivering between 10 and 20 gigabits a second over a distance up to 10 kilometers. And the cost of the pair was $50,000. And that's in quantities of ones and twos. In significant quantities, like 100 pairs, the cost could get down to as little as $25,000 for the pair. And when you compare that to digging up the roads or putting up stringing fiber, it's dramatically better.
Yeah.
So I see terrestrial technologies moving in a direction of much higher capacity and lower cost. And of course, we've already talked about satellite capabilities and the like. So I think we still have plenty of room for further development of capacity. Now the only other big deal is getting cost out, getting competition up, so that students have choice, and creating infrastructure so that we can have wholesale and retail distinctions between wholesale and retail, so that the consumers can get access to a large number of retail choices.
Yeah. Amazing future ahead. Let's open this up to our audience, Vint. How about that? So I've got questions rolling in. So let me ask you a question from our audience. In the 50 years since I got my master's in computer science at UCLA, I've been astonished at the resilience of Moore's law. Now, how long can we expect it to accurately predict computer processing power?
Well, first of all, Moore's law was mostly about clock speed. And I think many of the people in the audience are well aware that we are no longer able to crank up the speeds of the clock. Part of the reason for that is power consumption and heat dissipation. If you try to increase power to increase clock speed, eventually you melt the chips. So that's not going to win. The solution to that was multi-core chips. And we have chips that are running 64 cores now. I don't know if there are any that are more than that, but it wouldn't surprise me. So that's one direction in which Moore's law has been tilted in order to achieve an increasing amount of computer cycles, even though it's not through the use of a single CPU running at very high speed. So that's one thing. The second thing is that we've experienced the utility of graphical processing units, which are relatively simple compared to, say, a floating point multiplier, but which are extremely good for certain applications. Originally, they were designed for gaming and for doing very rapid image generation, large numbers of triangles per second. But more recently, GPUs have been used to implement machine learning algorithms. And we've gone even beyond the GPU now. At least at Google, we have something called a tensor processing unit, which is specialized to machine learning algorithms, and which drives cost and power out while increasing the capacity of the system to realize very, very deep neural networks. So that's one dimension that's going. The second dimension is that we still are building supercomputers. And they're getting bigger and faster. And so I would not give up on that, although we may be seeing some shift towards the large, wide instruction set functionality, whereas for quite some time, the reduced instruction set theory was very effective, faster processors, simpler instruction set designs, but now we're starting to see some return, I think, to wider instruction sets. And of course, the third thing is quantum computing, which has dim echoes of the research work that was done by Jerry Estrin and Bert Bissell at UCLA in the 1950s. They called it fixed plus variable computing. They had an analog system and they had a digital system. And the idea was to use the analog system to produce an approximation to a partial differential equation, the nonlinear equation, and then take whatever the value was, which didn't have very high accuracy, and take that as the beginning of a digital computation that was using finite difference methods. And so the fixed plus variable was analog and digital. Some of what we do today with quantum computers is truly analog if you accept the idea that a quantum computation is an analog computation, where we're looking at the state variable of a qubit, for example, which is not 0 or 1, it's variable. And so that's one way of using quantum computers, is taking advantage of the quantum nature of the computer itself to emulate quantum processes. That's one thing. Then there's digital quantum computation, which is the moral equivalent of the idea of finite difference methods, where we're using quantum computations in a digital way. That is still to be, I would say, evolved. And most of the work that's going on right now is using the quantum nature of quantum computers to emulate quantum processes. But we will get there, I think, and certainly Google and others are investing heavily, IBM, Microsoft, and so on. And of course, many universities. So I think that quantum computing will certainly be important, because there's some evidence now that it can compute things that we could not compute with a digital process, with a conventional Turing machine. And this has always been a big question mark for me, but there seems to be evidence that a quantum machine is more than Turing complete. And of course, that's a great challenge for the researchers at UCLA to wrestle with. But if it's true, it means that there are computational regimes which we have not yet explored that may yield important benefits.
Indeed. Here's an intriguing one. If COVID-19 becomes a long-term problem, what do you think about the idea of using virtual reality to simulate person-to-person experiences?
Okay, this is actually hilarious. I mean, it's a serious question, but the reason it's hilarious is that I have this image. You know how people do virtual reality today? They put on this thing on their faces that makes them look like Darth Vader. And now imagine that you have two people who are trying to use virtual reality to communicate with each other. If they literally use cameras, then each of them will look like Darth Vader to each other, and that won't be conducive to a useful exchange. So you're going to need an avatar in order to represent yourself in this virtual reality. So suddenly a whole new business opens up, creating avatars that, might improve the quality of your actual, like I might have hair, and, there could be other repairs done through your avatar. And, although some people will say, boy, that sounds silly, I remember poo-pooing the idea that ringtones was a business for mobile phones. And of course, it turned out to be a $5 billion a year business. And part of the reason for that is everybody had a phone with them all the time and they all rang. And you couldn't figure out which one was yours unless you had your own personal ringtone. So it was a business. And that's why I'm just an engineer and I'm not a business guy, because I wouldn't recognize a business model if it jumped up and bit me on the cheek. So I think that we're going to see some pretty interesting uses of this virtual interaction. I will argue that more likely is augmented reality, where information about our environment becomes readily available to us. We sort of experimented with that at Google with the Google Glass experiment, which went on for several years. And I am pretty sure that we will get to the point where it will be possible to wear glasses that are able to convey information to us, including what are we looking at right now. Google Lens is a product. If you hold up your camera and take a picture and you say, what is it? The Google Lens application runs around in the World Wide Web looking for images that look like that and try to tell you what it is. And I'm a flower freak. I love flowers, but I don't know anything about them. And I always wanted to have a botanist coming with me, to go on a walk around the park. Well, now I have a botanist in my pocket. So I think this augmented reality has even more potential to it than the virtual reality does, except for one thing. I love the idea of students, especially young students in K through 12, being able to go to some virtual space lab somewhere on the moon and to interact with instruments which are in this virtual environment, except some of the instruments that are virtually represented are real instruments that are out there on the net. And when you ask it to take a picture of, that planet or, this galaxy, it actually does that. There's a telescope out there that actually takes a picture. So you can imagine merging a virtual laboratory with real laboratory instruments in order to allow students to do remote science. That sounds like a lot of fun.
Well, would have been hugely helpful to us in this whole COVID transition to transitioning labs and senior design projects and all of that. I can imagine there would have been no disruption at all if we had that kind of technology. Well, here's a longish question, so let me read this out to you. As a computer science graduate student in UCLA in 1980, I subscribed to a mailing list called Human Nets that was concerned with what would happen if everyone had internet access. Inconceivable at that time, the concern was how to structure that much information so non-technical people could find it. Search engines and the World Wide Web were the answer, but I wonder if we're not now outstripping their capacity to organize all of that information out there. Are there other information structuring methodologies on the horizon?
Absolutely, yes, there are. And Google and others are pursuing this problem. It's a very serious problem. It's related to another one, which I will get to in just a moment. The first observation I would make is that we are investing heavily in something called a knowledge graph. That knowledge graph contains words that have meaning, and the meanings are represented by links between words. And so, for example, if President Obama is a term in the knowledge graph, then it has links saying, where and when he was born or what jobs he's had, including being president, and other facts about him and relationships that he has. Now, the reason that's a valuable thing is to have these information and concepts and semantics in the knowledge graph is that we can use it to help us when we're doing web searches. So when someone asks a question or types in search terms, we take the terms that are in that expression and we run it through the knowledge graph in order to expand the search so that we can find things that have web pages in particular, that have words in them that you didn't use when you were making the query, but which are relevant to the answer because of synonyms and other kinds of things. So, you know, this expands recall. It also has the potential hazard of messing up precision because it's going to pull things back that you didn't ask for specifically. And yet it may pull things back that will be of interest to you. I remember somebody asserting, I forget who it was now, that the whole idea of a digital library was a terrible idea because if you did a search, you'd only get back exactly what you were looking for, and you would not have the serendipitous experience of wandering through the stacks, looking for a book and discovering the adjacent book was more valuable to you than the one you were looking for. And I would argue that our ability to do search and response is sufficiently, let's say, imprecise, that there's still plenty of room for serendipity in this space. So I see mechanisms for dealing with semantics as a very important evolution here. Machine learning is helping us with regard to applying that. But now let me make one other observation that I'm deeply worried about, and I know you know this, and that's all this digital content that we find so valuable. I worry that it may disappear because we didn't take steps to preserve it. And all you need to do is to think a little bit about the old PowerPoints that you might have created, which don't work anymore on, you know, the most recent versions of PowerPoint. I'm not picking on Microsoft here. It's the problem of backward compatibility is really tough. And if you're trying to preserve work that you've done in digital form over periods of decades, you have this challenge of what software will correctly interpret the file that I created 25 years ago. So we have to, you know, either redo the files, reformat them in the context of new software, or we have to run emulated old hardware and old operating systems and old applications in order to interpret old files. But if we don't want to lose the value of all the information that we're accumulating, we also need to worry about its preservation over significant periods of time.
Indeed. Right, here's a little bit of a nostalgia question. So what were the old days like with Einar Stafferud and the creation of mailing lists? Could you have imagined blogs and podcasts in the day?
So the answer is yes, although I don't want to claim credit here, but I want people to understand context. So even as far back as 1971, which is when the Arpanet was just beginning to blossom in terms of functionality and applications, email showed up, thanks to Ray Tomlinson at Bolt, Baranek and Newman, and everybody instantly recognized how useful that was because you could communicate with someone not in real time. Computer-mediated communication overcame time zone problems, which meant that you could work on projects with people who were not in your same time zone and you could still constructively interact. Very exciting stuff. Then came mailing lists very, very quickly after that. And you could see social media arising out of this. The first two mailing lists that I remember were sci-fi lovers, you know, people who argued over who the best science fiction writers were. And another one was called Yum Yum, which was a restaurant review, initially just in Palo Alto and eventually expanded to larger territory. Clearly a social mechanism. So mailing lists demonstrated the early promise of social media, except in a very limited way. And of course, game playing was also very popular, but the early text-based games like Adventure or Colossal Cave and things like that, which eventually, you know, emerged in a different form called Zork. Those games were clearly social engagement in addition to just entertainment. I remember playing the games with someone from the UK, someone at UCLA, and me in Washington, DC, we were all linked our terminals together at USC Information Sciences Institute and played the game together. So a lot of what has happened was nascent and visible. Another example, packet video and packet voice were experiments that we were doing on the Arpanet and the internet in the 1970s and early 80s. We couldn't do very much of it because the capacity of the system was low, but we could do enough of it that we could show that it was feasible. And of course, that was important to the Defense Department because they were asking, how does the internet become a basis for a command and control system? Now, of course, things become commercialized somewhere around the 1984 period when Cisco Systems started making commercial routers. Proteon was about the same time frame. Juniper comes later. And then comes internet service provision on a commercial basis starting in 1989 in the United States. And so, you know, all of these things were present. I would not claim that we could predict what the world looks like today in detail, but I think much of it was visible and some of the potential was palpable.
Okay, so here's an interesting one. Can you speak to the impact on climate change of cloud computing? Is there a way to understand or compare what that technology is doing to the planet, atmosphere, etc.?
So there is what I now consider to be a myth, an urban myth maybe, or maybe it's actually a rural myth because we often put data centers out as far away as possible. The myth is that that computing is somehow consuming just enormous quantities of energy and generating a lot of heat. It is true that it consumes energy. It is true that it generates heat. I would like to argue that Google in particular, and I can't speak for the other cloud providers, is at the point now where we are 100% green. But I want to make sure that I don't misrepresent this. Most of this is because we purchase wind power, for example, or other renewable energy sources over, you know, these are 30, 40-year contracts. And so we are contracted for the power we think we're going to need over those long periods of time from renewable resources that do not produce warming. With regard to the heat generated by a data center itself, we actually pioneered higher and higher temperature cooling systems over time. And at some point, we started using ocean water in the northern parts of Europe as a way of cooling because the ocean waters are still very cold up there. So we've gone a long ways to establishing a green basis for our work. And where we have been unable to do that, we have purchased carbon credits in order to do the offset. But at some point, I'm persuaded that we will be able to obtain enough power through renewables to not contribute to the global warming problem. Now, the second issue, of course, is driving the power requirements down for the computing that we do. And so there's a great deal of interest in finding lower and lower power computational capabilities. And although we're not so far into this that we're building our own quantum computers, I don't think we're building any of the carbon nanotube or carbon nanofiber computing, but other people are looking into that. So I think power requirements are going to will diminish over time. And so I am not persuaded that the cloud computing is contributing as much to global warming as many people seem to think.
Well, we're down to our last question or so. Here's one. Tell us about the inspiration that led to TCP/IP.
Well, and this, I would not say that there was inspiration as much as it was problem solving. Those of you who are engineers will appreciate that engineers love problems. I mean, engineers come and say, give me a problem to solve. And so in this case, Bob Kahn and I were presented with a problem, partly of his own invention, and that was the question, now that we have a successful demonstration of packet switching, how do we allow all forms of packet switching to interoperate in a uniform way? Given that we could not change any of the networks that we were using to do this experiment, to try to work our way through a solution. So we had Arpanet, we had packet radio, and packet satellite and Ethernet. They were all packet switched. They all had different latencies. They had different packet sizes. They had different addressing structures. They had different other parameters of performance, speed varied, and everything else. And all that diversity somehow had to be made uniform from the standpoint of the edges of the net. So that was the problem. And we came up with a very simple solution because, in a sense, there weren't any other choices. We had to build a thing called a gateway that knew how to talk to the two networks that it was connected to. The networks had no idea that they were part of an internet. They didn't know anything about internet addressing. They had their own address spaces. And we didn't try to change them to know anything about that. And so it was at the gateway and at the hosts, where in the case of the gateway, the IP protocol was known, but not TCP. And in the host, TCP and IP were both known, but the IP part was the important part that lets you refer to a destination somewhere in the internet. And I think the interesting choice of problem solving in our case was to not try to solve everything all at once in all one big protocol. So we learned the lesson of layering from the Arpanet. We learned the lesson of not trying to do everything at once. So example, the internet protocol, if you look at the documents describing it, says nothing about routing. All it says is, this is what a packet looks like, and here's a place for the destination address. We assumed that the router that accepted the network, the router that accepted the packet, would have figured out a way to learn the topology of the network, but we didn't try to build it into the IP protocol. We said, this is a research problem. And so allow lots of solutions to be explored and have those solutions instantiated outside of the internet protocol. And so there was a lot of decision-making along those lines to isolate and separate the problem spaces and to stabilize the interfaces between the various protocols in order to allow flexibility and discovery and creation of new protocols at need. And that openness of the internet architecture has contributed very strongly to its ability to adapt to new applications. One thing, and very important to say, is that the internet layer of protocol does not know how the packets are being carried. It doesn't care. And that was important. So we didn't specialize the IP for fiber or Ethernet or anything else. And that same layer does not know what the packets are carrying. They don't know what the applications are. And the result is that you can build new applications without changing any of the internet. Now, some applications won't work unless you have enough capacity, but we talked earlier about the rapid rate at which capacity is increased on the net, and therefore scaling has been achieved in a lot of applications that would not have worked 35 years ago.
Well, I mean, we're just about out of time, Vint. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And this is one of the great advantages of the internet. Just sheer pleasure of having you here with all of us. And, you know, a wonderful hour that's just zipped by as far as I can see. Thank you so much. I hope you guys are doing well. Stay healthy. And again, this has been really wonderful and really
Well, thank you so much, Dean Murthy. I want to say thank you to all the people who hung on for this whole hour of reunion, and to remind them that there is still plenty to be done to evolve the internet and its applications. There's lots of room for entrepreneurship and invention and creativity and everything else. So if you see problems and opportunities, go solve them and bring more value to this environment. Thanks again. Happy reunion.
Thank you. Thank you so much.